Episode 2 of the Disney Plus show, The Book of Boba Fett, The Tribes of Tatooine, does some very interesting things in how it portrays indigenous people and the cultural process of colonialism. Now, I'll grant you, this is a fictional world, and the Tusken Raiders are not a real indigenous group, and Boba Fett is not a real agent of colonialism. But let's remember that fiction mirrors life, and fiction as wildly popular as Star Wars will always have an outsized influence on society. That's why it's important to consider this episode's depictions of these very real and serious issues, and consider how portrayals like these can do good and ill. A couple of really important caveats before I get started. First off, I'm not a film or television critic, and I have no training in the criticism of cinema. I'm not going to attempt to do criticism here at all, frankly. I'm going to the best of my ability, reserve my judgment. I am a trained archaeologist and historian, and what I am good at is providing context. In this case, theoretical and historical context that can help us understand what's happening in this work of fiction. Most importantly, though, I'm not an indigenous person. I claim no indigenous heritage, and I do not pretend to speak for indigenous groups. My research focuses on colonial encounters between Native Americans and settler Europeans, especially in periods of violent conflict, so I have some knowledge here, but remember, I'm always going to be speaking as something of an outsider. It's necessary to recap the first 2 episodes of the series very briefly before going forward. Obviously, this section has massive spoilers. Frankly, this whole video has tons of spoilers. I'd suggest watching the episode first if you're interested in the series. Or to miss the worst of it, you can skip ahead to the next section of this video. The Book of Boba Fett follows the story of its titular character as he takes over running the crime syndicate previously commanded by Jabba the Hutt. The question of how he got here and why he even wants this responsibility seems to be the driving force of the series. Episode 2, The Tribes of Tatooine, begins with Fett and his partner Fennec Shand, brilliantly played here by Ming-Na Wen, interrogating an assassin they captured in the previous episode. Their interrogation leads them to the mayor, a local power broker who Fett believes should be showing him more deference. The mayor denies their involvement, and instead says that the assassin was hired by some of Jabba's relations who have arrived in town to take what they believe is rightfully theirs. They have an extremely cool-looking Wookiee to help them do so. Thus ends the happening now part of the episode, which we don't really care about for this video anyway. The rest of the episode constitutes a long flashback of Boba Fett's early days with the tribe of Tusken Raiders, an indigenous coded group who have long been represented as violent disruptors within the Star Wars universe. We're about to see them get the dances with wolves treatment. We open with Boba Fett struggling to respectfully learn the ways of the Raiders by getting his ass repeatedly handed to him. The tribe is suddenly and violently attacked by what can only be described as a space train. Several of the Tusken Raiders and their bantha are killed. Boba Fett is very pissed off about the treatment of his new buddies, and endeavors to help them rid themselves of the hated train. He does so by beating the hell out of a bunch of space biker gangers and stealing their speeder bikes. It's okay though, they deserved it because they were mean to Walmart Han Solo here. Next we get a montage in which Boba Fett teaches the Tusken Raiders to ride these Return of the Jedi as heck space motorcycles, including teaching the all-important jump from one speeder to the next maneuver. What follows is an excellent literal space train heist, in which Boba Fett and the Tusken Raiders destroy the train, steal the loot, some of which is literally just water, then let the bad guys go because they're the good guys. Next up is a wild set of scenes, in which Boba Fett participates in a series of what I think are initiation rites, which involve him literally snorting a psychotropic lizard, having a vision quest with imagery that will likely be important for later story developments, and retrieving a piece of wood from some sort of possibly sacred tree. He uses the wood to fashion a gaffy stick in the style of those used by the other adult raiders. That last part is a very cool scene, about which I'll discuss at length later. The episode ends with Boba Fett and the Tusken Raiders performing a ceremonial-looking dance together around a fire. It's a genuinely thrilling bit of cinema with some extremely interesting stuff to unpack, so let's unpack it. This episode draws from history at a couple of scales. One being actual historical events and processes, and the other being the history of film and other pop culture representations. In the biz, we call that historiography. So I want to start by recapping a bit of the actual history being referenced, then we'll tackle that historiographical event. The Tribes of Tatooine is clearly referencing the history of colonial expansion, probably taking inspiration from this process in multiple locations around the globe and many different time periods. Very strikingly though, and in keeping with the Western motif of the series, the episode riffs on the period of American imperial westward expansion during the 19th century. In school, you might have learned about the concept of manifest destiny, the belief among many early American leaders that it was the right and destiny of the United States to expand unabated from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast of North America. This was not a typical sort of nationalist agenda at the time, and it was, in my opinion, strongly influenced by its period and the idea that those territories were mostly inhabited by indigenous people rather than European settlers. I remember learning about Manifest Destiny in elementary school, and it being presented in a shockingly positive light. Later I learned the incredibly destructive, deadly outcomes of this philosophy and its related policies. The late 19th century in North America included a number of violent wars between the US government and native nations, as well as numerous outright atrocities like the murder of hundreds of Lakota people at Wounded Knee in 1890. Alongside direct violent actions, the US government applied perhaps subtler, but no less destructive tactics like the widespread dispossession of land, the founding of the reservation system, the banning of indigenous languages, the development of boarding schools for the quote-unquote civilizing of native children, and forcing the adoption of European farming and subsistence practices onto indigenous tribes. This episode presents imagery and dialogue that speaks to many of these realities, but focuses on one particular symbol of the 19th century genocide of Native Americans: the buffalo hunt. The episode revolves around the encroachment on Tuscan lands by a train carrying a group of violent raiders who regularly shoot the Tuscans and their bantha. I think this is a direct reference to a period in which the US Army arranged and paid for wagon trains for the express purpose of killing buffalo, spawning the famous phrase, quote, "Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." The historiographical references in this episode are pretty interesting too. Not surprisingly, this episode, like the first in the series and like many from The Mandalorian before, Tribes of Tatooine relies heavily on tropes and imagery drawn from the Western genre. Representations of indigenous people have always featured in Westerns, though they've not always featured in exactly the same way. Since the earliest days of settler colonialism, there have been pendulous swings of sentiment when it comes to depictions of native people in popular culture and eventually in cinema. From myths of cannibalism and paganism perpetrated by some of the first European explorers, to the romance of 19th century noble savage literature, to the portrayal of indigenous people as agents of violence and enemies of Western expansion, and finally, more sentimental, sympathetic depictions in the late 20th century deconstructive Western revival films, indigenous people have always appeared as symbolic reference for Western social values, and rarely for the purpose of depicting their genuine life experiences.
Actually, sir, I'm here at my own request.
Why?
I've always wanted to see the frontier.
You want to see the frontier?
Yes, sir. Before it's gone.
Tribes of Tatooine is probably most reminiscent of the 1990 film Dances with Wolves, starring Kevin Costner, Graham Greene, and Mary McDonnell. It is essentially a white savior story in which a non-indigenous outsider character arrives serendipitously to provide an indigenous group with the knowledge and skills necessary to beat off the bad settlers. Further, it is a going native story, where the settler character lives out the fantasy of being accepted and adopted by the indigenous group in every way, through their military prowess, their language, their cultural practice, and most notably in their spiritual practice. The fact that the settler character Boba Fett is played by Temuera Morrison, who is of part Maori descent, is very interesting, though it probably does not excuse the use of common and sometimes destructive settler narratives. Within the context of the show, the episode is sympathetic to indigenous sovereignty rights and ultimately shows the bad settlers failing to destroy their way of life. However, it also highlights a number of stereotypes about native people that have existed since at least the beginning of cinema as an art form and probably much longer. The last thing that I want to do is look at this episode through a theoretical lens, thinking explicitly about some of the scenes and how they actually do a pretty good job of recreating some things we see in the archaeological record of colonial encounters and entanglement. Let's focus in on this scene, wherein Boba Fett collects a piece of culturally important wood, then participates in fashioning of that wood into a gaffy stick. The scene strikes a balance between practical considerations and ritualistic ones, wherein the gaffy stick serves as both a pragmatic weapon and tool, as well as a symbol of initiation into adulthood as a member of the tribe. All of this draws heavily from anthropological examples of practices in many cultures from around the world and throughout time. These sorts of activities are not even exclusive to hunter-gatherers like the Tuscan Raiders. They can be found in cultures of all types and sizes. Some elements of this scene really remind me of a lot of things I've seen in my own research on 17th century colonial entanglement, though. Before I can explain why, let me give you a little crash course on the history of culture contact theory and archaeology. Since the earliest encounters between European settlers and indigenous people, settler cultures assumed that with time and pressure, indigenous groups would simply disappear. They believed that their cultures were so superior, their technology so much more advanced, and their beliefs so much more morally right that this outcome was inevitable. Early anthropologists continued to work within this framework, even if they were occasionally critical of its assumptions. We call this process of culture change acculturation. In an acculturative model, you need only apply the mathematical formula of power to determine that with time, the dominant culture will come to exist exclusive of the non-dominant one. Well, this theory has a fundamental flaw in it. Can you see what it is? The answer is the continued existence of indigenous people and communities. Hundreds of years deep into the project of colonial domination, and millions of indigenous people and thousands of indigenous cultures persisted. To address this, and to also address the changing expectations of the morality of judging any culture as superior to another, anthropologists and archaeologists altered their expectations. During the 20th century, scholars began to recognize that colonial encounter was certainly not a one-way street. Rather, cultural practices and technological choice flowed between settler and indigenous, and from indigenous to settler. There is a fluidity of movement when it comes to practice and knowledge. From this notion came the idea of hybridity, in which, with time, cultures merge and become something new, a hybrid or Creole culture. While hybridity theory does address the inherently hegemonic nature of acculturation models, it's similarly flawed. In the end, hybridity theory inevitably ends in the supposed destruction of indigenous communities, instead seeing them as integrated into settler cultures. Still though, indigenous groups persist. In the latter 20th century, anthropologists began to adopt a third approach, sometimes called indigenization, a theory championed by Marshall Solins and Arjuna Padarai and many others. In an indigenization model, we explore cultural practices and traditions through the lens of who is practicing them. In this way, an indigenous community can and will adopt ideas, things, beliefs, or whatever else they deem appropriate from a settler group, but they filter those ideas through the lens of their pre-existing culture, thus indigenizing them. They literally make the practice indigenous. Thus, Christianity as practiced by an indigenous group is indigenous Christianity. A cell phone used by an indigenous person is an indigenous cell phone. This idea goes all ways too. The same is true of the way that any culture adopts new ideas from a colonial encounter. The gaffy stick scene, and many other scenes in this episode, have elements of the process of indigenization on display. If we look at the costuming of the characters, their use of technology like the speeder bikes, and the production of the gaffy stick itself, we can see this adaptive, fluid reuse of cross-cultural objects and ideas, and the ways that characters accept them as perfectly natural, perfectly culturally appropriate. The gaffy stick itself reminds me a lot of so-called trade points found on 17th century archaeological sites in New England where I work. These are arrowheads made of brass that were commonly used by indigenous groups in the region from the period of first contact with European settlers until the widespread adoption of flintlock rifles in the latter part of that century. One of the most popular goods traded for by native people during this period were brass cooking kettles, made in England or in the Netherlands. Instead of using them as cooking vessels though, or perhaps in addition to using them as cooking vessels, it can be a little bit hard to tell, these perfectly good kettles were cut up and turned into a number of brass tools and pieces of personal adornment, notably the brass-tipped arrowheads used by indigenous people throughout the period. This is to me a beautiful example of indigenization at work, taking an object made in Europe and reimagining it, in this case physically so, into a recognizable and long-standing cultural object. While there are much more subtle examples of indigenization in all colonial settings, the trade point and the gaffy stick as a fictional example are both great instances of the process at work. The Book of Boba Fett is a western set in an entirely fictional universe. Unlike the westerns of 20th century cinema, Fett is not limited by any need to link it to real or imagined historical truth. Nonetheless, the show's makers have decided to reference many elements of the cinematic traditions of the medium and real historical events and processes. They've done this, I suspect, to hold our attention and to give us something that feels familiar, that feels authentic. Whether they've done a good job begs a deeper analysis than this, but I do hope that this video has given you some tools to think about the show critically going forward.